Bienvenidos! Today we're going to talk about commands in Spanish. Commands are statements that we make when we're telling someone to do something or not to do something. And in Spanish, the verbs in commands take different forms depending on if we're talking with somebody familiar to us or somebody in a formal situation. Because in Spanish we have the usted, ustedes, and tú verb forms. And in Spanish, when we talk about commands, when we're talking about familiar commands, those would be informal commands or tú commands. And when we're talking about formal commands, those would be usted or ustedes commands. And when we're talking to somebody with respect or somebody that we don't know. With commands in Spanish, they're a little different from in English. In English, we don't ever use the pronoun you, even though we're talking directly to somebody. But in Spanish, that pronoun can be used, tú or usted. And also with the familiar commands in Spanish, the affirmative commands have different forms than the negative commands. So an affirmative command would be when you're telling somebody to do something, and a negative command is when you're telling somebody not to do something. So first we're going to take a look at negative tú commands or negative familiar commands in Spanish. This would be when we're telling someone we're familiar with not to do something. Now, when we're conjugating a verb in Spanish and we want to tell somebody we're familiar with not to do something, we just take the yo, present tense form of that verb, and drop the O off of the end. If it's an AR verb, we add ES to the end of it. If it's an ER or IR verb, we add AS to the end. So with negative tú commands, our verbs are either going to end in ES or AS. And we're going to add those endings onto the yo form. So let's look at an example. No hables por el celular. Don't talk on the cell phone. Okay? And we have an AR verb, hablar. We take the yo form, which would be hablo, drop the O, and add ES. Hables. No hables por el celular. No escribas ningún mensaje. Okay, and there you can see it's an IR verb and we have AS on the end. No pidas la cuenta. Don't ask for the bill. No me lo digas tú. Don't tell it to me. Don't say it to me. Now in this example, we're using the pronoun after the verb. When we add that pronoun, we're adding a little bit more formality to it. It's a little bit more emphatic. No lo pongas en la mesa. Don't put it on the table. Notice that these object pronouns come before the verb. No lo escribas. Now, because of spelling changes in verbs that end in CAR, GAR, and ZAR, sacar, apagar, and almorzar are examples of those verbs. There are going to be some spelling changes in the negative tú command forms of these verbs. So for the CAR verbs, we add QUES on the end instead of just ES, and it becomes no saques. GAR verbs become GUES on the end, so it's no apagues. ZAR verbs, we change the ending to CES, and it becomes no almuerces. And then there are some irregular verbs like estar, no estés, dar, no des, ser, no seas, ir, no vayas, saber, no sepas. Now, when we look at the usted and ustedes forms, the formal command forms of these verbs, there is no difference between negative and affirmative. These are just negative tu commands. The affirmative tu commands are covered in a different video. The affirmative and negative ustedes commands follow very similar rules. We use the yo form, drop the o, and for AR verbs, we add e or en on the end, depending on if it's usted or ustedes. For ER and IR verbs, we add a or an on the end. If it's usted, we add a. If it's ustedes, we add en. So in this example, we could say, hable por el celular. That means talk on the cell phone. We could put the ustedes after hablen. Hablen ustedes por el celular. And in English we would never say, talk you all on the cell phone. But in Spanish it's okay. It's grammatically correct to do that. It adds a little bit more formality to it, a little bit more emphasis to it. So you're being a little bit more demanding when you use that pronoun. But it's grammatically correct to do that. Escriba usted el mensaje. Write the message. No la pida. Don't ask for it. Okay? Dígamelo. Tell it to me. Now, for affirmative commands, we add the direct object and indirect object pronouns onto the end of the verb. And we do have to add an accent mark because the emphasis remains on the verb. Dígamelo. Póngalos en la mesa. Put them on the table. And this is the ustedes form, y'all. Sea inteligente. Be intelligent. No vayan conmigo. Don't go with me. And as in the negative tu forms, the same verbs are irregular in the usted and ustedes forms. So sacar would be saque or saquen. Apagar would be apague o apaguen. Almorzar would be almuerce o almuercen. Estar would be esté o estén. Dar is de or den. Ser, sea, sean. Ir, vaya, vayan. Saber, sepa, sepan.